I'm going to start off this video by reading a passage from Matthew. But before I do that, I want you to notice in my field behind me all the snow that's out there. It is April 24th, and I have probably a foot of snow still in my backyard. Now, to be clear, this is Alaska, and if you don't like snow, move to Southern California. But, I mean, really, April 24th. So back to Matthew. I'm going to start reading in Matthew 21, but I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm just going to give you some background, and then we'll start reading in verse 33. So Jesus has just done the triumphal entry, and if you haven't watched the video that I posted right before this one, number 9, you need to watch that one, probably before you listen to this one. I've tried to do these so that you don't have to do them in any sort of order, but there's so much information that I just had to break it down into 2 sections. So go listen to that one if you haven't yet, and then come back here, and then you can pick up where you left off. So the triumphal entry, Jesus has just done that, and then he goes to the temple, and he occupies the temple with his probably at least 70 disciples, and he upsets the whole system for a day, and the Roman guards are overlooking what's happening at the temple, especially during the Passover time. And so Jesus is causing a ruckus in the temple with the Roman guards overlooking and ready to step in if need be. And people are getting nervous because what if Jesus starts a revolution today? What are the Roman guards going to do? Is it going to ruin the whole Passover for everybody? That question is in the minds of the people who are there at the temple. But then at the end of the day, Jesus just packs up and goes home. So he goes back to Bethany, and then the next day he goes back to the temple, and the temple authorities ask him, who gave you the authority to do the things you're doing and to say the things that you're saying? So the thing about being a Messiah is if somebody thinks that they are called to be a Messiah, there's steps that they're supposed to take. And what that is they're supposed to go to the temple authorities and say, hey, I think that I'm called to be the Messiah. And so the temple authorities then will ask questions, and they'll look into the antecedents of the person, and they'll figure out whether they think this person is called of God to be a Messiah. And then they will either say, yes, go ahead and be the Messiah, or they'll say, no, we don't think that God is calling you to be a Messiah. Well, Jesus never did that. Jesus never came to the temple authorities. And so that's why you see them asking all the time, when are you going to tell us if you're the Messiah or not? And it seems pretty obvious to us that Jesus has said, yeah, I'm the Messiah, right? But he never went to them and asked their permission to be the Messiah. So that's what they're all upset about. They want him to have their stamp of approval so that they're in charge of the situation, and Jesus is not doing that. So that's why they're asking, who gave you this authority? And so Jesus answers their question with 2 parables, and I'm going to read you the second parable. So this is in Matthew 21, verse 33. Listen to another parable. Jesus says, there was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and went away on a journey. When harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. And Jesus said to them, have you not read the scriptures? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, or cornerstone, some versions say. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. When the chief priests and Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. So Jesus is quoting a verse from the middle of Psalm 118. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this. It is marvelous in our eyes. So before we jump to Psalm 118, and take a look at what this means, I want to ask you a couple questions. First of all, what is your understanding of this verse? So you're probably going to answer, well, Jesus is the stone. He is being rejected, but he's going to become the cornerstone. Okay, that seems to be the Christian understanding of this verse. Now let me ask you another question. Where do you get this understanding from? Maybe you read it in Matthew Henry's commentary. Maybe you heard a preacher preach on it. Where does it come from? Did you figure it out yourself? Does it just like it fits because Jesus is saying the stone the builders rejected? Actually, we have some authority for understanding Jesus as this cornerstone. When Peter preaches his famous sermon from the steps of the temple and 5,000 of his Jewish kinsmen join the new movement, he very specifically says, and it's in Acts 4, verse 11, he very specifically says, this cornerstone that you have rejected is Jesus Christ the Messiah. So we have a very good basis. It's Peter is telling us that Jesus is the cornerstone. So we can hold on to that idea. Now, here's something that you should know. In our day and age, there is a big movement right now to say that Jesus never claimed to be God. And in a sense, he did not sit there and go, right here, God, this is me right here. He didn't do that, but there's lots of little hints. And if you are a Jewish person, you would be picking up on these hints. And the prevailing idea in our culture right now is because Jesus didn't claim to be God when he was here on earth, it was something that his disciples made up later on. And they took the things that Jesus said and they twisted them and tried to make it seem like Jesus is God so they can claim he's God, but in actuality, he never claimed to be God, so he's not really God. But here's a phrase that I really want you to remember. I got this from Dr. Ken Bailey, and I thought that it was really important in our understanding, especially of the Gospels, but of Peter's writings as well as Paul's. And here's the phrase, authoritative insider interpretation. So what this means is that the people that hung around with Jesus, the people that followed him, his disciples, the ones who learned from him, they grew to understand what Jesus was talking about and what he meant and what he said by what he said. And so when they wrote down, okay, Jesus said this and it means this, we can take that as authoritative. They were insiders, and this is their interpretation of what Jesus said. So authoritative insider interpretation is what gives us the confidence to believe Peter when he says, this Jesus whom you crucified is the stone that the builders rejected, and he has become the chief cornerstone. So I want you to hold on to that idea just in general, because you're going to get, if you haven't yet, you're going to get this thrown at you, that Jesus didn't really say he was God, and it's something his disciples made up later. So now we will jump to Psalm 118, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of this particular psalm. I told you in the last video a little bit about what it meant and what it was used for, but I didn't talk much about where it came from. So the first question to be answered is, who wrote Psalm 118? There are three different ideas about who or when the psalm was written. Some scholars think that it was written by Moses or during Moses' time period. What they base that on mostly is that a lot of the ideas are the same ideas as what you see in some of the songs that we do know that Moses wrote. I don't know if you know this, but David didn't write all of the Psalms. So it's very possible that Moses wrote this. Another faction thinks that David wrote it, or it was written at least during the Davidic times, so it would then be called a Davidic psalm. And then there are some scholars who think that it was written at the rebuilding of the temple after the exile in Babylon and when they came back. So those are the three kind of serious options. I kind of like the idea that David wrote it or it was written during David's time, partly because of how they use the psalm. The psalm is used, as I said in the last video, to celebrate the completion of God's saving act in bringing them out of Egypt. So the Passover meal is celebrating the beginning of that saving act of God. And at the end, this psalm is used to celebrate the end. So it would make sense that it would be sung when the people finally felt that they had a kingdom, which would have been when David was crowned king. So it seems very probable that David wrote this, as I said, a pageant for when he was going into the place where he was crowned king. But we have to remember that the temple did not exist at that time. Now, the idea of the psalm written to celebrate the finish of the temple coming back from the Babylonian exile changes the focus of Psalm 118. Instead of the completion of God's saving act of getting them out of Egypt, it would be the completion of God's saving act of getting them out of Babylon. And it celebrates the building of the temple, not necessarily the crowning of the king. So, I mean, who am I to say that one or the other of these factions is wrong? But it's just easier for me to think about it as being written during David's time. And if you just heard that beep, that means that my tea is done steeping. So I'm going to put this on pause and go get my cup. Okay, so here we are back. Now, where was I? So as I said before, this was written as a pageant, and it was written as an acknowledgement of somebody sitting on the Davidic throne. So when people would quote this psalm or sing this psalm, that's what they were thinking of. The people in Jesus' time, they were thinking of the time when someone from David's line was sitting on the throne. Of course, during that time, there is not a Davidic king on the throne. And so not only are they looking back at that time and remembering that God completed his act of salvation from Egypt by putting a Davidic king on the throne, but at some point in the future, now they're looking ahead to the future when once again there will be a Davidic king on the throne. So Jesus taking part in this pageant during what we call his triumphal entry was a very strong statement that here was a Davidic king who was going to be on the throne for the nation of Israel once again. But we're looking specifically at this metaphor of the stone that the builders rejected. Jesus has, as I said, done the triumphal entry. So Psalm 118 has already been applied to him. He is reinforcing this here with the temple authorities, the Jewish authorities, by repeating what the people have said and definitely applying it to himself, because remember, he's answering that question. By whose authority are you doing this? And we tend to focus on the idea that Jesus is calling himself the cornerstone, but really he's answering the question with the second line of his quotation, the Lord has done this. It is marvelous in our eyes. And that phrase, it is marvelous in our eyes, seems kind of weak because the word marvelous doesn't really mean that much to us anymore. Really what he's saying here, that word marvelous, means that we marvel at it. And the reason that we marvel at it is because it's a difficult thing to understand. So that's really what that phrase, "it is marvelous in our eyes," means. It means this is difficult to understand. The Lord is doing this. The Lord is making this cornerstone that is about to be rejected into the cornerstone, and we don't understand what's going on here. So through this interaction that Jesus has just had with the temple authorities, his listeners understand a couple of things. First of all, they understand that he is claiming God's authority for what he's doing. They understand that he is claiming his Davidic right of kingship in this situation. They also understand, because of something I'm going to read to you here in a minute, that he is claiming to be the Lord Almighty. He's claiming to be God in this passage. And we see that here. I'm about to read this to you. "He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed." This is a quote from another Old Testament passage. It's from Isaiah 8. I'm going to read that to you real quick here. Isaiah 8:13 and 14. "The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. He will be a sanctuary, but for both houses of Israel, he will be a stone that causes men to stumble and a rock that makes them fall." So when Jesus says this, "He who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. He on whom it falls will be crushed," the people remember that prophecy from Isaiah as well. And they remember that it's the Lord Almighty who is that stone that people are going to stumble. So who said that Jesus never claimed to be God? In all these little ways, the people that were listening to him would have understood his claim to be the Davidic king and to be God as well.